Good day, colleagues. I think we can start and then people can join us as we proceed. My name is Dirk Troske. I'm responsible for business planning and strategy in the Western Cape Department of Agriculture. And this today is the shortest day in the Southern Hemisphere and the longest day on your side. So I hope all of you already had your second cup of coffee on this longest day. So just a little bit of background. On 15 August 2019, Secretary Ross from the California Department of Agriculture paid us a visit. And we were very positive, or there were very positive discussions about cooperation in future. But we said before we sign anything, let us first have some discussions and see if there's synergy between the two regions. So to make a long story short, COVID-19 happened. And on the 7th of October, we had a water use efficiency webinar. One of the positives about COVID-19 is that we started using all sorts of new technology. So we had that webinar, and that was followed by a climate smart agriculture webinar on 20 July 2021. Based on this, we approached the California Department of Agriculture, of Food and Agriculture, and asked, are you interested in entering into an agreement with us? That agreement was signed on the 11th of March 2022. And today we are bearing the first fruit from that agreement, and that is this webinar. So with that said, I'm going to give over to my colleague from California, Josh Eddy. Josh, over to you.
Dirk, thank you so much. I greatly appreciate it. And again, we look so forward to working with our colleagues in the Western Cape and others to further kind of climate smart agricultural adaptation. Wine is such an important industry for both California and the Western Cape. And these seminars bring us an opportunity to bring together not only the farmers and ranchers in both of our countries, but also academia and also policymakers to discuss some of the shared challenges that we have around climate change. So it's truly a pleasure to be here today with our colleagues to discuss this important issue in terms of climate change adaptation in the wine industry. And I can think of no better individuals to help set the stage than our first panel focusing on climate change adaptation with Allison Jordan and Gerald Martin. So with that, Allison, I'd like to invite you to provide a presentation.
Thanks so much, Josh. And let me get this shared. Okay. So I really appreciate the invitation to join this dialogue. I'm always really happy to have the chance to share the California wine experience around sustainability and also climate-related activities, and also to learn what other regions are doing and how they're handling some very similar issues. I've had the pleasure of working with the California wine industry with both growers and vintners for the past 20 years. I'm Vice President of Environmental Affairs for Wine Institute and Executive Director of the California Sustainable Wine Growing Alliance. And certainly this topic is becoming increasingly important. And I think the link between sustainable and climate smart practices is becoming all the more clear. So I know I'm going to be talking about adaptation as well, but I feel like you can't talk about adaptation without talking about mitigation. They're both important and often they go hand in hand. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the activities we've undertaken around measuring and reducing greenhouse gas emissions and also increasing carbon sequestration. And the industries work together for a number of years. Wine Institute and the California Sustainable Wine Growing Alliance, that partnership between Wine Institute and the growers organization in the state. We've worked for nearly 2 decades with our members, with other ag associations, also with scientists to better understand climate change and the ways in which wineries and vineyards can both adapt and mitigate those effects. So I'll go through some of these projects briefly, but generally they've all been focused on creating industry tools that help drive adoption of sustainable or climate smart practices, and also building resiliency to climate change impacts. So the first one was a project that we worked on with UC Davis scientists, and it was really to gain a better understanding of topics like carbon sequestration by vines, energy use, nitrogen management, other farming practices. And this goes back to the early 2000s. We felt like we had a pretty good understanding of the emission sources in winery facilities, but less so on the vineyard side. So this was a way for us to better understand the current knowledge and also where there might be some research gaps. And we created this user-friendly handout that you see here, really providing some directional information. It wasn't very precise yet, but at least it gave people a sense of what practices had what type of impacts and the sort of scale of those impacts. And during this project, we also learned about the denitrification and decomposition model. It's DNDC for short. And we started seeing modeling as a way for us to be able to help fill some of those information gaps. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. So next, we created online performance metrics, and these are free, easy to use, hopefully user-friendly for growers and vintners to measure, track, and then ultimately improve their use of natural resources and reduce their carbon footprint over time. And really, as you can see, all of these metrics are related to climate change mitigation, adaptation, or in some cases, both. I mentioned the DNDC tool, and it's quite complex, but we basically worked with a consultant and scientists to calibrate and validate this model specific for California vineyards. It had already been being used in agriculture around the world, and it was a way for us to better understand vineyard emissions and sequestration potential. This, we then, once we calibrated and validated the very complex tool, we integrated a very simplified version into our online metrics. So that was a way to make it really simple for growers to be able to use. And another activity that we undertook, again, around the same time, Wine Institute worked with a consultant to conduct a study of our carbon footprint and really to look at what are our hotspots, or those places where we have the biggest opportunity for improvement to reduce emissions. Things like packaging, applied nitrogen in vineyards, electricity use, and distribution were some of the big ones that we found. And we published a summary of this study. And the other thing I wanted to mention is our works on the international field. And we've worked closely with FIVs on a number of different sustainability topics related to the environment, also related to climate. And we work with FIVs and other partners from South Africa, Australia, Chile, New Zealand, and Europe to create the International Wine Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And this was really a way for us to help standardize measurement of winery and vineyard emissions and how people measure it. So now I'll talk briefly about adaptation. And this is an area where we actually worked with CDFA back in 2012, I believe it was. They brought together a group of ag associations, including Wine Institute, farmers, stakeholders, and basically looking at what are the potential climate change impacts for agriculture. And this document has since been updated, but I think all of the items on this list are still viewed as really the key impacts that we need to consider. Clearly, water is a really big one in California with our cyclical droughts, and something that we've been paying attention to for a long time, and I think have developed really good ways to both conserve and be efficient with our water use, but clearly it's something that we need to work on in an ongoing way. I also added two that weren't raised back in 2012. One, obviously wildfires. And we've been working with coalitions on ways to prevent and prepare for wildfires, and also how to address their specific impacts for vineyards and wines. The second is really that the other one I added was the growing number of regulations and increasing market pressure. So I think those are other ways that we really do need to adapt as an industry. And of course, with those impacts, there's lots of different ways that we can adapt. And so you can see here just some of the ways and water conservations. And again, one of the really key things that we need to be able to do. So education and information sharing is really a key part of the Alliance's mission. We also manage a certification program, which adds that third-party verification that certain sustainable and climate smart practices are being used. And we started with this very high-level definition, but it really is that comprehensiveness of sustainability that includes soil management, energy and water use efficiency, air quality, even the human resources and community aspects that I think really make it an important approach for mitigating greenhouse gas emissions and for adapting to change. And this is a glimpse of our California Code of Sustainable Wine Growing, which was developed by Wine Institute and the growers in 2002. The Sustainable Wine Growing Alliance that I serve as executive director for was created a year later in 2003. But as you can see, it's this really comprehensive set of sustainable wine growing and winemaking practices. We do consider it a living document. It's always being updated. Climate change was added, I believe, in the second or third edition, and we're now in the fourth edition, which was published in 2020, and we've added even more still. So the time was going to mention that also that the CDFA's Secretary Karen Ross was actually the president of the California Association of Wine Grape Growers. So I really do credit her leadership for our sustainability initiatives, but also for all of the work that's been done on climate smart agriculture. And we also work on hosting workshops, so other ways that we really try to provide tools and resources for growers, that bringing in experts, showing all the different cost share opportunities, and asking wine growers to share their experience. It's that peer-to-peer education that I think has really led to the success of our program. And our certification is another really key aspect of this, because it really does provide that third-party verification that practices are being implemented. And we launched certification first for vineyards and wineries back in 2010. We since updated the program in 2017, basically to certify that it's a certified wine, meaning that both the winery and vineyards must be certified. There's an additional chain of custody audit. And so that just adds that additional credibility for any logo or wine claims on wine labels. This also requires an annual third-party audit, so it adds that rigor to the program. And currently we have 80% of California wine now being made in a certified sustainable winery. Roughly a third of our acreage is certified, and another 22% of our vineyard acreage is certified to some of the other California programs. So I really think these numbers are especially impressive when you think about California being the fourth largest wine producing region in the world. So the impact we can have by implementing these practices is really significant. And all of the California vineyards and wineries that are certified are implementing climate smart practices, tracking metrics related to emissions, and also building resiliency to those impacts. And the last thing I wanted to mention is our current activities within Wine Institute. We brought together an advisory group, a working group that's really helping to guide our strategy around what we want to do in terms of helping members with climate action. And I think it's really important to put this in context. The initiative is really in response to the broad scientific agreement about the need to limit global temperature rise for agriculture, for society at large. And also the fact that climate change is increasingly important in public policy and in the marketplace. And this just gives you a visual. You don't have to read all of it, but from governments, California has ambitious goals. We have a statewide carbon neutrality goal and 100% carbon emission-free electricity goal by 2045, and also need to reduce emissions 40% below 1990 levels by 2030, so coming up very shortly. There's also, of course, a number of countries that California wine is exported to that have net zero goals or laws in place around climate action. And also our retail partners, some of the other wine regions that we compete against, and also individual wineries have established climate change related targets and initiatives. So the other one I wanted to mention is the International Wineries for Climate Action, which was established by the Jackson and Torres families. They have a growing list of members from California and from wine regions around the world. So within that context, some of the activities that we're focused on include accelerating sustainable agriculture by providing resources, seeking funding. CSWA, of course, is already working in this space, and we have a climate-focused grant that is pending, and that would allow us to do even more. Also, the second issue area is decarbonizing energy. And we recognize that wineries will make their own decisions about how and when they'll decarbonize, but we think we can support these efforts by seeking funding, securing partnerships, providing tools and education, and also advocating for public policy that helps wineries optimize their energy efficiency, also electrify their operations, and importantly, adopting renewable energy. Another issue area is around the value chain, which is really tricky because it has the biggest climate impact, not controlled by a single winery. And we plan to work with our members to identify common priorities and opportunities, to work with coalitions, to advocate for public policy, again, all around encouraging decarbonization of the value chain. And then finally, building resiliency. So again, helping our members with their vineyard and winery workforce and their resiliency in terms of their practices and their adaptive management strategies to be able to adapt and be resilient in the face of climate change. And again, we think that wineries will make their own decisions and actions, but at the same time that we can use our core competencies as an association to educate and motivate and really support our members. And we recognize that this type of collaboration, we can achieve more progress more quickly and more cost effectively. And I think that international collaboration can be a really key part of that. So I'll end there, and thank you so much. I'm happy to answer any questions later.
Allison, thank you so much. Greatly appreciated. At this time, we're going to hold questions until after our next presentation. Gerard Martin from WineTech will now provide a Western Cape perspective.
Thank you, Joss. Can I go ahead? You'll share my presentation? Thank you. Thanks again for this opportunity to share some of the activities that we do within WineTech from a climate change adaptation perspective. I think it's just important to give everybody on this call who's not familiar with WineTech and where we fit into the South African wine industry structure, some sort of an overview of where we fit in. So Joss, if you can just maybe go to the second slide. Yeah, so the industry structure, it's made up of a couple of industry bodies, Vinpro, which is the wine grape producer body, representing about 2,500 producer sellers and associated members. You'll find also estates in that grouping. And then Salba, which is all of the big producing wholesalers. WineTech, in essence, is an affiliate of that. And where we slot in with the other business units in the industry, like SAWAS and Wines of South Africa, and also the transformation unit looking at economic transformation activities in the industry. WineTech's responsibility is to look after research, innovation, knowledge transfer, and learning and development. So in essence, my perspective for this webinar is to look at what is the South African wine industry doing from a research perspective, and how are we then doing things in terms of innovation, what we bring to the table to present growers with some sort of tools to adapt to the changing climatic conditions in South Africa. So Joseph, can go to the next one. So maybe just a sense to give you how we function within WineTech. We've got normal research calls that we put out to industry based on specific needs that were identified from growers and producers. We then compile specific concept proposals from prospective researchers in the industry, mostly from universities. And we provide them with feedback in terms of the prioritization of that. So the WineTech team will sift through all of the applications and come up with those that are priority. I think for us, over the last couple of years, it's been that sustainability and climate change is on top of everything that we do. And that takes us to something that we've been focusing on a lot, is to compile sort of flagship programs within WineTech, where we go together with industry and think tanks and construct or co-create specific research programs. And the whole sustainability initiative came from that. There's currently about 3 flagship programs within WineTech. One is the climate database, and I'll give some more detail on that. We've got a second, or the second one is the whole water usage, efficient use of water. And we've got a couple of projects running on that. I'll give some detail on that as well. And the third flagship program is on breeding or pre-breeding. Breeding is quite a new thing within the South African wine industry. And we're putting together, collaborating with industry role players in Italy, but also from other sectors in Germany, to look at marker-selected grape varieties and using that to do pre-breeding trials within our South African context. And then the last sort of way that we do things is where we look at innovation. We go out and do pitching dens, get people who's maybe not just from inside of the industry, but also from other sectors or other industries, to propose and come up with new ways of doing things. And I mean, we've got a lot in terms of new tech, sensor technology, using and working with engineering students from different sectors. And I think that also plays into how we want to adapt to climate change, using new tech that has been applied in other sectors, and how we can make sure that some of these initiatives is available for the industry as well. And all of that then leads to innovation for our sector. So Josh, if you can go to the next one, please. So the first flagship program that I've mentioned was, we call it TerraClim. It was based on a lot of R&D that was done in the South African wine industry by Dr. Tara Salve. And after her research thesis was completed, she then went out into the industry to get an understanding, but what are the real needs for industry from a climatic perspective? And all of the industry players said there's not a centralized climatic database where they can really understand and get to grips with how climate has been changing over time. I think for us, with weather station data being not so readily available, and long-term weather station data, which was a big problem for the South African industry, it was important to get all of the sources together, to get in a central place where we can collate all of these data, so that we can make more informed decisions and provide growers with tools to make more informed decisions as such. So TerraClim, in essence, is a centralized 30-year climatic database. It is high resolution terrain layers, 2 meter by 2 meter resolution, and then also high resolution temperature layers. I think currently what we're doing is a whole crop suitability tool that we want to provide growers with the opportunity to understand where to plant what, and also to get a detailed climatic profile of the specific farm, so that they can benchmark within the area what cultivars and what rootstocks are working optimally, and how do they benchmark with their neighbors in the region. And I think that is quite an important tool, because of how climate is changing in the Western Cape. We need to understand where we can plant varieties more suitable for these regions. And I think for us, it's important to get those type of information to the industry in a much more centralized way. So Josh, if you can just go to the next slide. Yeah, as I've said, this has all been done to get better informed decision making, but it's also short-term decision making and then long-term decision making as such. So this tool is not just available for the wine industry. We're also talking to the fruit industry. There's a lot of interest from fruit growers and also from academia nuts. So there's adjacent industries in the agricultural sector that is also getting benefit from investment that was done within the wine regions or within the wine sector as such. If you can go to the next one, Josh. So another project that we've been collaborating on with the fruit sector and with the Western Cape government is Confronting Climate Change initiative, where we've since 2008 developed a carbon calculator, getting an understanding of where our emissions from a carbon perspective, where we're getting the most emissions. And I think it's very much in line with what the stuff that Alison said in her presentation in terms of packaging, transport, a lot in terms of electricity. And as you would know, electricity is quite a big concern or problem within the sector or in our country. And I think for us, it's to get an understanding where we can improve and where we can adapt, and to make sure that we manage our emissions more effectively. So this initiative is quite important for the industry from a benchmarking perspective, but also to get an understanding where we can adapt more in specific areas. If you can go to the next one, Josh. Then water is quite a big initiative within in the industry as well. As you would know, between 2015 and 2017, there was quite a big drought in the Western Cape. And that actually forced the industry to look more effectively as to how we use water in the sector. And I think this is where new technology plays quite a critical role for us. And this is where we use a lot of new tech to understand where we're using water, during what time of the day the plant, the vineyard is using more water as well. And we've seen a lot of monitoring and data and things that we can use to irrigate more effectively. And I think for us, this has been a very small trial that we did in one area in Stellenbosch. But I think the fruits of this is where we now want to apply this to a more model vineyard, where we just started with the University of Stellenbosch, where we planted a model vineyard to look at how we can use water more effectively. So you would find that all of this stuff is early days, but it's from a research perspective, it's quite important for us to make sure that we really understand how vineyards react to irrigation practices and how do we adapt our irrigation practices. And in some cases, we've seen where we've got trials in different regions. Josh, if you can move to the next slide. We've got some trials in 3 different areas, Stellenbosch, Olifants River, and Redeklof. I know not all of you might be familiar with the regional diversity, but for us, those 3 regions represent how we can, it's a microcosm of what's happening in the industry, and we can get good sort of feedback from those specific sites. And so what we've we've done irrigation trials within those areas to get an understanding of what time during the day, how long, and also to see the quality and the yield, what effects does it have on the vine. And we've seen some significant results on this, and I'm sure that Conrad Skitter, my colleague from Winpro, will maybe touch on those things when he talks about the practical sort of application of this. So our stuff is more from a research perspective, as I've said, but I think there's a lot that goes into this and can really go to growers to use water more efficiently within their operations. We've got a lot of demo days as well, where we invite growers to come and see the improvements that we've got with less water. And I think there's some significant improvements that we've seen. And I think growers are really also trying to, or getting to understand how they can, with less water, get the same quality and even get the same yield as such in their vineyards. So if you can go to the next slide. Then we've also got a trial where we use alternative cultivars. I know that this is quite a big thing worldwide, where we see that new cultivars or cultivars that's not so familiar to us in the sector, looking at drought-resistant cultivars from white and red. We benchmark these cultivars with our normal cultivars that are planted in our regions. And it's important for us to get an understanding of all these drought-tolerant cultivars that has been proven to give significant effects or increases in yield and drought tolerance in other regions, how they fare from a South African perspective. So how, from our South African conditions, do we see that these cultivars are also effectively against or are effectively against drought in our regions? So it's quite a new thing for us, but I think the trial has been going on for 3 years. There's some results, but I think it's also too early days. Last year, we had a lot of rain within the growing season, so that put us on the back foot a little bit. But I think there's some interesting results that we're seeing in different regions as well. So Josh, if you can go to the next one. Then, as I've mentioned, the last sort of flagship program that we've got from a research side is looking at plant breeding or pre-breeding. And this is mostly in terms of, we've seen that with more rain in the growing season, we've seen there's a lot of powdery and downy mildew. This season, that was the case as well. And I think for us, it's important to get an understanding how we can use marker-selected or for genetic traits from other regions in Italy and in Germany, and how it can be effective to do crosses on our side. It's still early days in this regard, but I think there's a lot of lessons and from other areas that we can apply in our sector. And I think for us, it's important to showcase that we are willing to collaborate. I think that is for us a critical thing. A lot of the growers or the institutions in the north or northern hemisphere has done a lot of work, and we want to see how we can collaborate with these institutions to bring these technology and new ways of thinking to our sector as well. So that is just from a research perspective what we are currently busy with in our sector. I think we still got a long way to go in terms of how do we adapt to climate change and what type of initiatives we are bringing to make growers more effectively or how growers to adapt to these changing conditions. And I hope it gives you a sense of what we are busy with from a R&D and innovation perspective in the South African industry. Thank you.
Sure, thank you so much. I think what we'll do now is go to some questions. So if you have a question for the panel, if you could please use your raise hand function and I'll be able to unmute your line. Ashia, your line is open. You are muted. Ashia? Your line is open, but you're muted.
My apologies. I'll lower my hand. I don't have any questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
May I ask a question?
Of course, Allison.
Gerald, I was really interested in the TerraClim that you talked about, the modeling about impacts. And I was just curious, was that something that you all funded, or were you able to get government assistance with that, or how did it work?
Yeah, thanks, Alison, for that. It was actually funded by the South African wine industry out of research funding. As I've said, Dr. Tara Southey, we funded her PhD studies. And out of that, after she went out into the industry, that was actually identified as a need to get a climate database, a centralized climate database. And out of that, Tara then constructed with some other departments within the University of Stellenbosch, a climate and terrain database what GeoSmart is actually the company, also a spin-out company in the university. So TerraClim is in essence a spin-out company from research. They just went commercial this year, and the WineTech and the University of Stellenbosch and TerraClim, the founders, Tara Southey and Adrian van Niekerk, they are the sole shareholders at that initiative. So we didn't actually receive government funding for it. We did collaborate with the Department of Science and Innovation in terms of some support for the research side. And then from I think the biggest support that we got from government was actually through the ARC, where we got some of the weather station data, long-term weather station data from them. And that was about it, but no real funding support from the government as such.
And I have another question. Karen, your line is unmuted.
Hi, I am curious to know, we hear a lot about management practices that might help maximize carbon storage in the soil. You mentioned, Gerald, the importance of looking at how you're generating your electricity or your power needs, whatever. I'm curious if you've parsed it out to gains to be found in, for example, greater efficiencies in irrigation water management, thus less pumping. Have you parsed it out? I'm an agronomist, and I'm thinking of growers who are perpetually admonished to do a better job of holding carbon in the soil. And in some of our environments, that's very challenging. And I'm wondering how much quote unquote credit they're getting for things like, does your model include energy use efficiency benefits? Does your model include the benefits you're seeking in breeding for drought resilient varieties, things like that? I'm just curious how those are being captured, not just in your effort, but in other efforts as well. Thanks.
Can I answer on that? So Karen, thanks for that. I think from our perspective, yeah, the soil question is quite a big question on our side, and we still, it's, in research, there's always a lot of variables that play into all of this to get a holistic understanding of how you parse out, and I think we haven't really done a lot in terms of that. It's early days in terms of what we are doing with energy and how do we use irrigation or wastewater more effectively. But I think definitely these are the type of questions that we are currently grappling with in our context, and to see how we can use water more effectively, how all of these practices will influence the soil quality as such. But we haven't done a lot of work on that, so I can't really give proper feedback on this. I think it's early days on our side, and we're trying to get an holistic understanding of all of these elements and how it impact for growers.
And I'll just respond to, from the study that we did, the applied nitrogen was really the biggest impact for emissions on the vineyard side, and yet it wasn't enough to make it make sense in any sort of market, any sort of carbon market. So we didn't pursue that. But at the same time, there are some programs like CDFA offers with the Healthy Soils program that does at least help with cost share and some economic benefit to growers that are implementing certain practices. And the DNDC model that I mentioned, you can basically change some of the practices that you're using, and it pulls in weather data and some publicly available data sets, and then growers can add information about their cover cropping or about their irrigation or about their applied nitrogen, and then that impacts the model. So just a few other comments on that topic.
Perfect, Alison, Gerard. We have one more question. Ken, your line is unmuted.
Hi, good day, all of you. And Alison and Gerald, thank you for your inputs and really, really interesting. Gerald, nice to see you. We have the most incredible South African program developed by, and we talk about sustainability, we talk about IPW, integrated production of wine. And so many facets of what we're discussing here today are included in that program. That program goes to certification on the back of the bottle, on the seal on the bottle. My specific concern is that, yes, it's absolutely essential that we do all of these things. As farmers today, we have an absolute responsibility to the planet to make sure that we leave it in a better state. There's no question about that. So that's not in discussion, but we do need to communicate at a commercial level with our clients, with the public, with wine buyers. And we do need some level of certification which makes a difference to a buyer. Given that the buyers are looking at bottles in a retail environment where they see bottles paraded, displayed on a shelf, there needs to be some instant note on that bottle that dictates or says to a buyer, you're good to buy this stuff. This stuff's been got all the boxes are ticked. And I really think it's essential that we find some sort of certification that goes to the front label, that goes to the front of the bottle, that communicates what we're doing. What we're doing is absolutely fantastic, but standing in a cupboard whispering doesn't help the public know what we're doing.
It's such a great point. And actually, in our program, we don't limit it just to the back label. So that's something I think for South Africa's program to consider. And some wineries are putting it on the front, but we let the wineries make their choice about where they want to place it. And at this point, it really does seem like the retailers, the gatekeepers, are the ones that are showing most interest. So it at least gets viewed as something that, is sort of a point of differentiation, or in some case, a market entry issue. And so definitely I think certification is a piece of the puzzle in terms of how we communicate to our buyers, regardless if they're retailers, restaurateurs, somms, or to consumers, the end consumer. And I also feel like we need to do a better job connecting climate smart practices and sustainable practices, because I think in the global marketplace, that's the issue that's really of concern. So that's something that we're doing a lot of thinking about. How do we best communicate that that's really core to what we're talking about when we talk about sustainability?
Perfect. And thank you, Alison and Gerard. Thank you so much. And I know that we do have some more questions. We do have another panel coming up, so unfortunately we will need to move on. So if you would like to enter your questions in the chat to the panelists or into the Q&A, that would be great. And panelists, if you can look at the chat and respond on Q&A as well, that would be greatly appreciated. So thank you so much in terms of the overview that you provided. It was very inspirational in a sense. Gerard, especially the pitching dens, I really like that. Similar to our innovation hubs and how we can connect a wide variety of activities that we have. But at this point, we would like to move on to kind of our practical lessons in terms of hearing from the growers on the ground in terms of some of the practical applications that they're doing. So Conrad, I would like to invite you from the Western Cape and Vinpro to provide a presentation.
Thank you, Josh. Can you see my shared screen?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you for the opportunity to share a couple of thoughts on the management of grapevines during the drought period. So Gerard already showed in his opening slide the structure of the South African wine industry. And working for Vinpro, we represent about 2,500 wine grape growers in the country. So during the dry period, which peaked around about 2018 and 19, we had a tremendous amount of calls from those growers asking for help, how to handle the situation. So within that period, we actually put together a task team. And that task team consisted of about 10 different viticulturists that represents 10 different wine growing regions. So we're quite a diverse industry with about 90,000 hectares. So that's about 225,000 acres of wine grapes in the country, spread over 10 different wine growing regions. So we got a representative from each of those wine growing regions. And then we also got in a really high profile Dr. Philip Myburg, that actually wrote a book on the irrigation of wine grapes in South Africa. So this is a copy of his book. And we sat around a table, and then we said, okay, so in terms of practical lessons and applications, what can we do on an immediate basis and put that information out for the growers? So we compiled a document that we call the drought document. And I'm going to share a couple of insights from the drought document. So most of them are indeed scientific findings that Dr. Myburg wrote about in his book. But there's also some practical observations from the vineyard side, from myself and my colleagues, that we thought we should include in this document that can actually add value to the wine grape growers. All right, so firstly, let's see if this moves forward. Interesting that it doesn't want to move forward, Josh.
Conrad, why don't you just do it that way instead, if it's too difficult the other way? Just go to your next slide.
Okay. So you see the one with the slide deck in it?
Yes. Perfect. That's
okay.
The next slide.
All right. So some of the factors that we need to consider regarding the plant water use, evaporation and irrigation is obviously that the bigger canopies have a bigger water requirement. So we try to maintain the canopies as small as possible with various wine growing techniques. Then in terms of soils with a medium to high water holding capacity, we did avoid frequent irrigation applications. So that actually means that we would rather apply a big irrigation less frequently instead of applying less water per irrigation. And that is just based on research done by Dr. Philip Myburg, where he actually indicated that you can lose up to about 30% of the volume of water, even if you put that down with a drip irrigation system. So something that was quite interesting to see within these drought periods, that a lot of the producers starting to irrigate during the nighttime. So if you drive around, we have a lot of mountains, especially in the Stellenbosch wine growing region, and you will see a lot of trucks or producers moving around with headlamps at nighttime, which made that quite interesting. And that was to reduce the evapotranspiration before infiltration by irrigating at night. And then something that seemed to me quite simple, but made a huge difference, is just general maintenance on the irrigation systems. So stuff that we looked at was avoiding leaks and damaged pipes to make sure that the irrigation system is functioning at the correct pressure, and then also cleaning the filters on a regular basis, which might sound quite simple, but if you work with a lot of vineyards, then it's really helpful to actually go and have a look if they are indeed maintained correctly. And maybe just on that specific point, I can add one of the previous questions was, do producers look at things like solar panels? So currently, a lot of the producers are looking at solar panel installations to use with their pump stations. And they're also looking at building reservoirs at a higher site to actually use gravity flow for irrigation systems as well, where possible. So the next slide that I have over there is just an image of damaged pipes. We're definitely seeing a lot less at this stage. Then the second point that I want to put on the table is measuring the soil water and plant water status. So definitely a huge shift to measuring before we starting to irrigate. So the measuring is leading to informed decisions and successful implementation of irrigation strategies. So this is especially crucial in the years where water resources are limited. So that will avoid irrigating behind the point where the soil can hold the water, thus avoiding subsequent water losses through drainage below the root zone. So mostly a lot of the researchers in our environment make use of neutron probes on the left-hand side, but a lot of the producers are indeed adapting towards capacity probes, the ones that you see in the middle, or even the Scholander pump that's on the right-hand side, where we make use of leaf water and stem water potential to measure the amount of stress in the vine before we put out any water in the vineyards. Then the slide that has the big yellow machine, the bulldozer in the middle, I think in terms of root distribution and soil preparation, that's probably my second most important point. So the first one that we realized was definitely site selection, and Gerard touched on that, where you can use platforms such as TerraClim to decide where on a specific property, or if you have more than one property, which are the cooler sites and which are the warmer sites that you can use for a specific wine goal. But I think in terms of importance, this is probably the second one that we observed in the dry periods. So we want to do correct and deep soil preparation at establishment of the vineyard, and that will lead to well-developed, extensive and well-distributed root systems. And that would actually enlarge the buffer capacity of the vineyard during that dry period. So if the topsoil layers are getting drier, the vine roots can actually go and get the water down at the deeper levels if we prepare the soils up to 1.2 meter. Then water budgeting, it might sound quite logical, but really in those dry periods, we actually sat down with a lot of producers and calculated the calculations in terms of water budgeting. So that informed us with helping in the dry years, where it's crucial to know how much water do you need and how much do you have available for the season. So in some scenarios, we did not have enough water to irrigate all vineyards, and then we had to make a call to say, okay, now we're going to allocate that specific amount of water to premium blocks or maybe new plantings that does not have such a deep root system. And some of the mediocre blocks that indeed not always receive water when they need it. So then it's also necessary to adjust the yield and the quality targets based on your available water supply. And up to this day, that's still something that we do at the start of the wine growing season. So indeed a lesson well learned during the dry period. Then in terms of timing, so let's say you only have enough capacity or enough water to put down 1, 2, or 3 irrigations. When would be the correct time to put that down according to research? So if we only have enough water for 1 irrigation, according to Dr. Philip Myberg research, the best time to put down that water would be before flowering. I think most people in the wine growing industry do realize that flowering is a really sensitive stage when the berries are actually set, and you don't want any stress on the grapevines because that could affect the yield negatively. Then if you enter a scenario where you actually have enough capacity to put down 2 irrigations, you would ideally put that down before flowering, and then the second one at veraison. At veraison, it's also a critical stage. We have a lot of the flavor and color components being translocated from the leaves to the bunches, and you do not want any stress over there to get good quality grapes. And then indeed, if you had enough water for 3 irrigations, you would apply the first one before bud break, second one at flowering, and then the third one at veraison. Then if we move on and we have a look at the soil surface management, something that made a huge difference was definitely people that, or producers that made use of mulches. So the organic material limits the surface runoff and evaporation loss. And then later in the season, the mulch will also result in a higher soil water content in the deeper soil layers compared to bare undistributed soils or where the shallow tillage took place. And I also like that. It's kind of a green practice. So you're moving away from herbicide use. And I must say, on a practical level, I've been in a couple of vineyards where we had mulches in the one vineyard, probably almost the same soil type to the adjacent vineyard, and the the vineyard that were mulched did fare a lot better than the one that did not receive any mulch. Then also lots of talk about natural mulches or cover crops. So in the Southern Hemisphere, we mostly plant our cover crops in the month of April. And then you need to manage that throughout the season. So it can compete for the grapevines for water. So we do manage that at budding. And the main advantage over there, or one of the advantages, definitely that it suppresses the weeds and it makes the diversity of the weeds easier to manage if you need to manage them. And then it can also, we also make use of soil moisture probes that can help with decisions as when to spray the cover crop with herbicides, or if we need to roll it flat if you do not want to use a herbicide. Obviously, in terms of weed control, weeds compete with grapevines for nutrients and water, so we need to manage that really carefully. So people that look at chemical weed control, we are seeing a lot of mechanical weed control at this stage. So I think over there, we must be careful not to destroy our feeder roots close to the soil surface. And then also you don't really want to open up the soil in shallow tillage, because that could increase the evapotranspiration compared to bare or undistributed soils. When we have a look at the fertilizers, so only necessary to apply quantities of phosphate and potassium fertilizer if the analysis do indicate that we do need to apply them. We were really careful in terms of applying any type of nitrogen. And that is also to keep the canopies a bit smaller. So we wanted to keep our vigor in check. And yeah, we tried not to apply any fertilizer on the soil surface if there were no rain, because then it will not get washed into the soils. I think I already touched on the point of the young vineyards. Just remember they do have a shallow root system. So they must be on the top of the priority list if you are looking at your water budget or your irrigation scheduling. And then just 2 or 3 slides to end off with the pre-harvest considerations. So when we look at grape sampling, the extreme dry conditions that definitely intensify variation within the vineyards. And thus it also is important to do correct or proper sampling in the vineyard, especially where we did see differences in vigor, yield or soil type. We did sample that separately for ripeness monitoring. And obviously we had to monitor that more frequently prior to harvest to confirm the analysis. And that obviously will put some strain on the resources as well. Then if we have a look at the ripening and fruit parameters, generally in the warmer, drier seasons, the fruit ripening is advanced and harvest dates tend to be earlier. So the sugar that accumulate faster and grapes may end up at lower acidity compared to other years. Grape stress grapevines often have higher pH levels, and the optimum ripeness level window tends to be shorter during the dry period than normal cooler seasons. We did see smaller berry size, which increases skin to fruit ratio, which is an indicator of higher concentrations of tannins and anthocyanins in wines. However, the stress can actually drastically reduce the amount of phenolics and anthocyanins, which counters the concentration effect. And the effect of acid additions on pH and TA is less predictable in years where the grapevines are under additional stress. Then when we actually go to the harvesting and processing trends, we did see that we mostly observed earlier harvest dates and a shortened ripening period. So the grape intake for red wines might overtake with the white grape wine intake. So that placed some strain on cellar space. The temperatures at harvest might be higher compared to other years. So that obviously placed some pressure on cooling facilities. And where the grapes needed to be transported long distances, some additional sulfur might be needed to protect the grapes from the higher temperatures. And then remember, we are also working with dehydrated or smaller berries that could contain less juice than normal, which made processing at the winery more challenging with bridging some of the receiving hoppers or blocking some of the must lines. So a lot of the winemakers tried to keep some free run juice to the one side and added that back to the must to assist with the pumping operations. So yeah, that was a quick couple of the practical considerations that we do include in this draft document. And thank you for your time, Josh.
Conrad, thank you so much. Greatly appreciated. And now we'll go to our next speaker, Will Drayton from Treasury Wine Estates. And then after that, we'll take some questions. Will?
Great, thanks, Josh. Give me 1 second to bring up the presentation. With any luck, you guys can see that. So hi, my name is Will Drayton. I work for Treasury Wine Estates here in California. We're actually a global operation, and we have wineries in several places around the world, in Australia, New Zealand, Europe, and the Americas. But I'm primarily based here in California, looking after our technical viticulture, our research, and our sustainability. And it's actually a great timing for this discussion. I just got out of the American Society of Enology and Viticulture Climate Change Symposium yesterday, which is part 1, and part 2 is around climate change and how it might affect the winemaking process next year. So I guess that's opening the doors and an invitation to anyone who wants to partake in that. It's been a great session, and many of the lessons and take-homes that was mentioned today came up yesterday and in a lot of detail. So anyway, I'll keep this relatively short and towards practical lessons rather than everything we're doing. But it was very nice of Alison to kind of show on her slide that we do have some pretty big commitments at Treasury Wine Estate to make sure that we're running on 100% renewable electricity globally by 2024, and that we intend to have all of our, our own footprint, our scope 1 and 2 emissions to be net zero by 2030. So we're running hard at the problem of climate change right now, and trying to do our part. So I guess my first point about practical lessons is that past experience is not always going to be a good predictor of where we're going now, and we've got to remember that. And so partnerships like this between South Africa and California are incredibly useful, as are looking at warmer areas and how they work currently. Because if you just apply the lessons of what you've done for the last 30 years on your family farm, they're not going to be sufficient to predict where we're going. And as obviously you can see, everyone's familiar with these sort of charts. This is on the left-hand side, global CO2 concentration, on the right-hand side, depending on the climate scenario, where we'll be heading. But you can see pretty quickly that within the lifespan of a vineyard planted, we're not going to be in the same situation whatsoever of where we started. And so irrigation strategies, the harvest timing, and everything in between is going to have to step up in order to compensate for that. One fantastic tool, and I'm glad the weather tool was put up earlier, but one fantastic tool that Californians have available to them is CalAdapt, and this takes the global climate models and solves the problem of what does my farm look like in 5, 10, 20, 50, 100 years time, by downscaling those global IPCC climate models and making them relevant to your local area. Just as an example for California context, the global models that are normally used by the UN, etc., would not place any difference between the growing climate in Napa and the growing climate in Lodi. They'd all be within the same square in these global climate models. And so this downscaled model allows you to do all sorts of really fantastic kind of planning, and it allows you to think about, what do I really need in the future as climate change is going to be happening? What should I be doing with my water resources? How should I plant? What varieties might work? I would put in a little plug to say, if anyone's listening, we should increase the number of crop-specific metrics in this, but heat weather and wildfire and rainfall and snowpack, they're all predicted in this model and incredibly useful for just planning out where should I invest and what should I be doing in the future. And a good point about this, just to take it straight back to water, is that rain in California, according to these models, is mostly staying about the same, except it's not. So same average rainfall, except the variability of rainfall we're expected to be getting is all over the place. And that really changes how our strategies around drought, water storage, water application things will be happening. So you can see here on the left-hand side of this chart, this is a relatively recent prediction about where we're going to be going. And you can see the main problem is for the Northern Hemisphere that spring and fall are going to be getting drier, so less rain in those, and then a greater peak of rainfall over those winter months. Add to that snowpack and some other things, you can see that the water we're getting is going to be coming in short bursts, and we're going to need something to do something, although they'll all risk losing that same quantity of water that we had beforehand, but out to the sea. So storage is going to be incredibly important of all types. So the water we have, precipitation is going to be falling a lot more as rain. We have the Sierras in California. There's an incredible resource. It's one of the biggest reservoirs you can imagine of snow that's there that then is slowly released throughout the growing season. That's going to change significantly by mid or end of century in whichever scenario you end up following. And in fact, if we're on a business as usual kind of scenario, then probably by 2050-ish, we'll start to see the first effectively snow-free Sierras, which has huge implications for growing in California. And so we're going to have to do a lot in order to mitigate those changes. Reservoir building, groundwater storage, soil moisture improvement, soil health, all of these things are going to be tools. And I don't think any one of them is going to be able to do that for us alone. The other thing that's going to be happening is it's not just the water that we have, it's how those heat waves interact with that water. So we're expecting to see heat waves of increasing intensity, duration, and frequency. And so a very practical thing is, water efficiency is fantastic and probably number one, but your ability to apply that water when you need it, even if you have the water you need, is going to be a critically limiting factor. So increasing the number of pumps or water conveyances or being able to irrigate parts of your field simultaneously is going to be very important to make sure that you don't have water, one part of your vineyard that has been irrigated, a few days ago going into heat wave, and then the last part you managed to hit a couple of weeks ago because that's how long it took you to irrigate your various blocks. And with all of this, it's going to be really important to kind of eke out every last bit of water efficiency. So increasingly, we're seeing tools to help with planning, water budgeting, to bring together many of the technologies already been talked about, from soil moisture probes to satellite imagery to transpiration measures, and try and help plan out both which varieties need the water primarily, what age of vines need the water, what soil types will do, and how things are responding, so that irrigation scheduling can become that more efficient and water can go where it really needs to. New water sources are also going to be incredibly important for us, and we're a big champion of that. A great example is the Los Canares Water District at the southern end of Napa. That takes water, which is pretty much an uninterruptible supply from the wastewater of the city of Napa, and treats it to be good quality for irrigation water, and then is made available to all of the growers in a traditionally relatively groundwater deficient area, or at least one with limited pumping capacity. Similarly, McLaren Vale in Australia, big investments going in there, taking advantage of the city of Adelaide and allowing horticulture, grape growing to flourish in that region because of that. Equally, it's going to be really important to, it's hard in agriculture to use or reuse water often, but with things like frost machines or things where we have huge amounts of water come through quickly, we do realize that we can start capturing some of that water, putting it in reservoirs, and things like drain tiles and sumps, and pumping that water back again, especially when we're using it for frost protection. We can actually apply water to stop freezing. It'll percolate through the ground. We can pull it back out of sumps and reuse it again multiple times. So that way we don't start the season, beginning of a bad frost season with empty reservoirs, trying to figure out, scratch our heads how to get through the rest of the year. And then, of course, in many cases, vineyards are located next to wineries. And so capturing that winery wastewater, reusing it, And then making sure in the wineries that we have good sanitation practices and chemistry that is not going to interfere with vine growth. We don't want to hold heavy salt load coming into that wastewater that we'd like to use in the vineyard because of the consequences on growth and water stress after that. So chemistry is important, and moving to, certainly in California, it works with our soil types, a more potassium-based chemistry rather than a sodium-based chemistry helps to make that water more compatible with reuse in vineyards. We've done a lot of work converting our frost machines to wind machines. And these have the added benefit of being able to be done with auto start. So they just switch on when the temperature gets to the critical level and switch back off again when it warms back up. And with the general trend to fewer deep frosts, that's actually working pretty well. Most of our frosts in California are radiation frosts, so wind machines that stir up the air layers work really well. We're putting more pond liners in. Our colleagues in Australia are also experimenting with dam covers to reduce evaporation out of ponds. We're also making sure that where we apply water, we're applying it more precisely. So we have several vineyards which have soil type changes across them, and we put double drip in so that we can irrigate the drier part separately down the same row than the regular part, and perhaps transition from one drip system to another drip system mid-season to make sure that we're just using the water we need to, and has a quality benefit in that we can even up the distribution of vine ripening and other things within the field. Real-time evapotranspiration has been great. I'm a definite student of the pressure bomb, the show lantern that you guys used and showed, but also that does suffer from point source data. And so, as does soil moisture probes. So systems that can kind of measure a broader area and get an average of more vines at once are very useful. And then the key is translating those into actionable items for your irrigators and for your vineyard management team and whatever, so that they can take advantage of that recommendation. We are participating in healthy soils trials. We have a trial right now with the USDA experimenting with biochar. And the jury is still out on that. And we're hoping for more water holding and certainly more nutrient holding and carbon holding in the soil. But even if the carbon holding is all we get, then that the fact that we're surrounded by woody hillsides that potentially got a lot of material that will burn. And then we've got a place to put that burnt material right back into our vineyards to lock up that carbon so it doesn't get lost in the next forest fire is really important. And then you can't forget large-scale things like the Napa habitat restoration. Biodiversity is incredibly important, but you can pair biodiversity with holding on to more water in the wilder areas of your vineyards and the outside areas of your vineyards. We were part of one of the biggest kind of restorations of stretches of the Napa River to both widen it to make sure the water slowed when it was going out, and that had great benefits on fish, but also increases the water holding capacity of that, so you get less of these flash flood events that you'd be expecting with the way climate is changing. And more water in the environment, in the aquifer longer, is only good for recharging groundwater and making sure that the water's there in the summer months when we need it. Just very quickly, I'd be remiss to say, that vineyards often are not in isolation. So we do capture some rainwater for using in our evaporation towers for cooling. That's incredibly useful because it's such pure water versus pumped water out of the ground, and obviously it prevents additional strain on the aquifers. We also use a technique called pulse cooling, which is a much more efficient way of cooling wine tanks, where we batch in refrigerant and then wait for that refrigerant to warm up before we're moving new refrigerant in. That sounds technical, but what that basically means is it lowers the electricity you're using and lowers the water you're evaporating, because your cooling system has to work so much less. And it probably actually makes better wine at the same time. We also host one of the biggest solar hot water, probably the biggest solar hot water system in California, any winery, to run our bottling center in Sonoma County. And you can also pair that with absorption chillers to actually use solar hot water to cool your winery. So no electricity whatsoever. And in many cases, that's the most efficient way of transferring the sun's electricity into usable energy. Is not converting it into electricity and then back into heat again. It's just to keep it in that form. And finally, there's a very cool project we're working on jointly with UC Davis. It's called the Fluidized Bed. one process that we do in wine is to cool it down quite a lot to make sure that the little crystals of tartaric kind of fall out, so they don't end up, in a bottle in someone's fridge somewhere. But that's incredibly energy and water intensive. And so we're working on a process to do that outside of the tank. What that means is your entire thermostat in your winery can be turned up. Instead of having to have the whole winery super cooled in order to chill this one tank cold stabilization, you can run the entire winery at 10, 20 degrees warmer. And that has huge energy savings, carbon savings, and water savings implications. And the best bit about it is the crystals that we collect, we can then ship back to the manufacturer, and they can turn right back to us to reuse in the same machine. So we're excited about that, and we'll hopefully see some more of that in the near future. That's it.
Will, thank you so much. That was a great presentation in terms of a summary to kind of show us where we're at and some of the challenges that we have on the climate side, and then both Conrad's presentation as well. I see a lot of similar practices between the two. I'd like to now open the panel for questions. So Will and Conrad. And let me see. I do have one question so far. Ina, your line is unmuted. Ina, your line is unmuted, but you're self-muted.
Sorry, I didn't raise my hand, sorry. Sorry about that.
No worries, thank you so much. And I'm not seeing further questions at this time. Again, if you would like to ask a question, please use your hand icon and I will unmute your line. And I have a question from Karen.
Hi, could we get your contact information for all the speakers?
Yes, we'll definitely forward that out to the attendees. I think some have been put into chat currently, but we will definitely make that available and send that to the attendees. Well, Will and Conrad, thank you so much for this opportunity, and we appreciate your remarks. Dirk, I don't know if you would like to say some closing remarks from the Western Cape?
Yes, I would like, from my side, I would just like to say that the purpose of this exercise was to use the platform that has been created between the two departments, the governments on both sides, and to get the industry talking. And I think we succeeded that in this particular exercise. And specifically around the, I think there's potential to look at collective certification processes. I see in the chats the comments on regenerative practices. And then I really like the idea of climate change in the winemaking process as a potential way of going from here. So what I want to say, so from our side, it's the shortest day. That means it's the longest night. So we can now go home, lit a nice fire, have a glass of red wine, etc. While for you guys, it's the beginning of the longest day of the year. And I also understand one of the hottest days of the year. So you can now go and have a nice, warm, I don't know what, office period, and do whatever you have to do. So thank you for this opportunity. And I really enjoyed it from my side, and for the Western Cape also enjoyed it very much. Thank you very much.
Well, Dirk, thank you so much. And thank you to all of our speakers for providing some great presentations and again, sharing our similarities and the challenges that we have on climate and the importance of us all reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. So thank you so much for all of your participation. We look forward to further engagements and further topics with the Western Cape and appreciate all of your attention. Thank you, everyone.